Welcome to Bug Banter with the Xerces Society, where we explore the world of invertebrates and discover how to help these extraordinary animals. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/donate.
Hi, I'm Rachel Dunham in Missoula, Montana.
And I'm Matthew Shepard in Portland, Oregon.
Spend time in a garden and you'll probably hear the buzzing of a bumblebee. These charismatic bees pollinate many of the foods and flowers that we love, and similar to other bees, their populations are in decline. Fortunately, there's a community science program to help us better understand the abundance and distribution of bumblebees across the U.S. To talk more about this, we are joined today by Rich Hatfield. Rich is deeply involved with studying and protecting bumblebees in his role as a senior endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. You may also remember Rich from a previous Bug Banter episode when we had a conversation about honeybees. Welcome back, Rich.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's always a good conversation with you, Rich, so we really appreciate it.
Agreed.
I mean, bumblebees are social bees living in a small colony, which, as we've discovered along with our listeners from talking with other Bug Banter guests, is actually being social is pretty unusual for a bee. What can you explain what social means and how that makes their life cycle different from a solitary bee?
Yeah. As we all know at this point, with 20,000 species in the world and 5,000 species in North America-ish, it's hard to generalize and just say solitary bee and have that sort of be a thing. So before I sort of say how they're different, I'm just going to sort of define what a solitary bee is, and then we can define how we're different. So for the purposes of this conversation, we'll just say that the life cycle of a solitary bee is a bee that lives in a hole all by herself. It's a female bee. She's going out collecting pollen, filling her nest with pollen and laying her eggs in there. She dies at the end of the year after she's provisioned her nest. And then the following year, the following spring, her offspring will emerge and do the same thing all over again. So that female, that bee, that solitary bee, never meets her offspring. She only sees the egg, likely. And so that's our definition of a solitary bee then. Okay. And so how do most species of bumblebees differ? Yeah, the vast majority of bumblebees are social. There are also some kleptoparasitic or social parasitic bumblebees that are not necessarily what I'm about to describe, but the social bumblebees, generally speaking, are founded by a single individual. So a queen bumblebee emerges in the spring. She has spent the entire winter hibernating in a shallow hibernacula in the ground somewhere, maybe underneath a tree somewhere. She emerges in the early spring and starts flying around and looking for a place to build her nest. So this is sort of the solitary phase, or the end of the solitary phase of a bumblebee. And then they find a hole in the ground, like usually, and they will establish their nest in that hole, which is usually a pre-existing cavity that was often dug out by a rodent. So it'll have some insulation in there and some structure on which that they can build their nest. And she'll start building waxen pots, and then she'll start provisioning those waxen pots with pollen and nectar that she's collecting from the environment. So she makes these sort of cakes, pollen mixed with nectar, and she lays multiple eggs on those cakes and continues to build waxen pots and sort of lays eggs in there. And then she'll sit and actually incubate those eggs for a period of time. From egg laying to adult, it's about 5 weeks or so, roughly. And she'll spend a fair bit of that time with that first brood, just incubating and keeping them warm, feeding herself a little bit, but she doesn't leave the nest that often. And then eventually, 5 weeks later, those first eggs, those eggs go through, they hatch and they go through several instars. So a baby bee is actually a lot like a caterpillar. It looks like a worm of sorts. It's a colorless worm. It goes through several instars, and then it actually, just like a caterpillar, it goes through complete metamorphosis and emerges as a winged adult. So as I said, that's about a 5-week process. And the queen has been incubated in them. She's staying in there, but then she gets to meet her offspring. So she now has sort of members of her colony that she's interacting with. And that first brood that comes out are her workers. They're usually all, if things are normal, those are all female. And they will just start doing the resource gathering for the queen. So they go out and they gather pollen and nectar. They come back to the nest and they deposit the pollen nectar in these waxen pots that the queen continues to develop. And that continues for, depending on the species and the environment, that can continue for a couple of months. Or if we're in an alpine environment, it may be a really relatively short period of time that the colony has to sort of finish their life cycle, and things may get accelerated. But after some period of time, 5, 10, 15 weeks or so, the queen will switch and start producing the reproductive members of the colony. At that point, she'll, potentially they'll get fed more resources, and those females would develop into queens. And then because of sort of a unique genetic makeup of all members of the Hymenoptera, the family Hymenoptera, she can sort of decide, I don't know if that's really the right word to use, but whether to develop a male or a female. So she can lay the reproductive females or queens, or she can choose to lay an egg that will develop into a male. And again, choice may not be the right word. I don't know what the right word is, but you can sort of understand what I mean. They can decide, I guess, whether they're laying males or females. Insects in the family Hymenoptera exhibit something that we call haplodiploidy, or what we call single loci sex determination. Mm-hmm. And a simple explanation of what happens there is, if a female fertilizes an egg with sperm, so she's mated the previous fall, we hadn't really gotten there yet, but she's mated with a male the previous fall, she has sperm stored inside of her. And if she injects that egg with sperm, she's fertilized that egg will develop into a female. Okay. If she does not fertilize that egg and she just lays an egg without inserting sperm into the egg, it's a non-fertilized egg. It has one copy of the genome and it develops into a male. We believe at least the queen can decide whether or not to fertilize those eggs. And makes some level of choice. And so again, we've had a large worker corps bringing resources in. We're feeding these now reproductive members of the colony. So the new queens are born towards the end of the field season, and they'll go out and they will continue to forage for resources, build up their fat reserves. And they will also likely, hopefully, encounter males from other colonies for which they can mate with. As far as we know it, for the most part, they continue to return to the nest and take advantage of the resources and the protection of that nest until at some point, they get a cue or a signal from the environment that it's time to go hibernate, and they go out into the world somewhere separate from their nest. Some species we believe actually overwinter close to the nest. Other ones are likely quite far from the nest. Some species may overwinter in groups. Other ones may do so solitary. There's a lot that's sort of unknown about this phase of the bumblebee life cycle. But they leave the nest and they, dig that shallow hibernacula and start that life cycle all over again. The males, once they're born, it's believed that they leave the nest and they never really return. So they spend their nights, sleeping on vegetation, underside of leaves. You can see this in your garden. It's kind of fun towards the end of summer or early fall. So the males sort of leave, likely disperse, and try to find females, hopefully from other nests, to mate with, to keep that genetic diversity in. And at that point, the rest of the colony starts to die off. The foundress queen, she just lives for 1 year. So at the end of that year, she dies. So she's interacted with all of her offspring. She's met sort of the next year's reproductive members. But she doesn't fly with them the following year. She dies, as do all of the workers and as do all of the males. The only caste that survives to go the following year are those new queens. And they will live for approximately a year until their new queens from the following year will do the same thing. And just to fill in one minor detail, it's believed that most bumblebees just mate with one male. So they're not mating with multiple males, although that has been known to happen.
And do males mate with more than one female? Do we know?
Probably.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
yes, I'm sure it happens. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if the female only mates once. I didn't know if that was like the male only mated once as well. Because
No,
yeah.
it's not like some of our other insect kin that get eaten after they mate or anything like that. So they're still out in the environment, and I'm sure, given the opportunity, they would mate again. Yeah.
Yeah, not sure. Because I know often we think social bee, we think of honeybees. So, from what you were describing, it's like one of the major differences between bumblebee and honeybee is the bumblebee is a 1 year colony and the honeybee is perennial. They make the honey to keep going through the winter or whichever season there's no bloom.
Yeah, that's right. So
Yeah.
honeybees for the most part are perennial. They,
Mhm.
as you mentioned, they have a different strategy for surviving the winter, which is
Sure.
to build up resources to make
Yeah.
it through the winter.
Yeah.
And the queen and workers, survive that winter.
Yeah.
And I believe there's also a differentiation sort of in the terminology that we use to describe the sociality of those two species as well. So for bumblebees, we use the term primitively eusocial. And for honeybees and other species like that have that perennial life cycle, we call them just plain old eusocial. And so there's actually a little bit of morphological differences in the queen as well. And so there's, and again, a lot more technical that we probably don't need to get into, but yeah, that is the primary difference between bumblebees and honeybees.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I know there are exceptions to the social bumblebees and the solitary nesting bees, but in terms of habitat, there are a couple differences between the two that you've mentioned. One is that the queens survive the winter and they have to shelter somewhere. And then they're also nesting in very different places than our tunnel nesting bees. So what are the things that bumblebees need in terms of habitat with overwintering and with that sort of social nesting or eusocial? Or I already forgot the term that you used. I apologize.
Primitively eusocial.
Yes, thank you. Primitively eusocial.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because I think generally speaking, when most people think about pollinator conservation, they think about flowers and putting flowers on the ground, which is undoubtedly an important thing to do. But it may not actually be the ultimate problem or the limiting factor for a lot of our bees. It could be nesting and overwintering. And so we do need to think about what do nesting and overwintering resources look like? And how do we create, protect, conserve them so that our bumblebees can complete their life cycle effectively? And as I mentioned sort of in my description of their life cycle, there's a lot that's unknown here. We sort of have descriptions of nests through time, like going back to the 1800s. There's been some research that's been done, but on an individual species basis, like if you asked me, where does this species of bumblebee nest? We maybe have 2 or 3 different descriptions of nests for that species. So there's a lot that's really unknown. But generally speaking, what we know about bumblebees is they nest in a couple of different locations. The primary location that they will nest is in an abandoned rodent burrow. So some hole in the ground, and the rodent could be varied. It could be a vole, it could be a ground squirrel, it could be a mouse, it could be a rat. It just basically needs to be a hole in the ground that's reasonably sized, that has like some insulation or other structure in it that the bumblebee can use, as sort of protection and warmth, probably, for those waxen pots that I was mentioning before. So that's sort of the standard bumblebee nest. We find them in rodent burrows. That's a thing, it's probably the most common. Where those rodent burrows are sort of in the world, some of them have been described in open fields, like in a meadow. Others have been described sort of relatively deep in the forest, and others have been described more on edge habitats, sort of on an edge between a meadow and a forest. So all different habitat types. So, when we think about conserving bumblebee habitat, we can't just be protecting open spaces, we also need to think about extending that out into the forest habitats that are adjacent to them, probably at least 100 meters or so, is a good sort of rule of thumb of thinking about that if you're a land manager. The other places that we've found bumblebee nests is in like rock walls, like little cavities in rock walls. Those have probably also previously been used by a rodent or some other animal that's created some structure and space in there. Some species of bumblebees have been known to nest directly on the surface of the ground, often underneath like thatched grasses, or if you think about sort of a tall bunch grass that sort of comes up, and then the leaves sort of start to die out and fall on the ground, they create kind of a sheltery area underneath those grasses that is somewhat protected from the elements and somewhat insulated from temperature changes. And some bumblebees have been known to nest directly under there, like in sometimes fairly large nests directly on the surface of the ground. The American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is a common species across the U.S., has been known to do that as a common species that does nest directly on the surface of the ground. And then there's a few species that also nest above ground in like abandoned bird nests. So Bombus mixtus, Bombus melanopygus. There's probably some eastern species as well that I'm less familiar with that do this. So those are kind of the major places that bumblebees are nesting. So from a homeowner's perspective, like what can you do to promote nesting bumblebees? Probably be messy, right? Like leave brush piles around. Maybe don't clean out that old bird nest and leave it in there to have some structure, and see if they nest the following spring. If they don't, then maybe clean it out for the birds or whatever. So be messy, leave some spaces, compost piles. They've also been found to nest, like in insulation in walls, old batting of couches, and they're generalists in some ways. The other piece that is really even less known than this is where they overwinter. So that nesting piece is where they spend their social phase. They also have the solitary phase where they're really by themselves in their overwintering hole. And we know very little about where species, especially at a species by species basis, about where they're doing this. Like we sort of know that leaf litter or pine duff is probably important. North facing slopes seem to be important, some mossy areas. But this is a really an area of active research that we're trying to learn more about is where do bumblebees overwinter and how do we help them? And so if you're a homeowner, trying to think about what to do for overwintering bumblebees, the best thing that you can do is in your, sort of gardens and unkempt areas is leave, that leaf litter and pine duff on the ground, all the way through spring till you see bumblebees flying in the early spring. And then at that point, if you want to clean up those leaves or the pine duff, that's a good time to do it. When you see bumblebee queens out flying, they've probably emerged, and a good time to clean things up. So again, being messy, particularly through the fall, and leaving that structure, in your yard and garden is the best thing that you can do.
I was going to say, I think my garden would probably, bumblebees would be like my garden. It's pretty messy.
Yeah, mine is too. It's kind of nice when you can be like, I'm not being lazy, I'm conserving insects.
Exactly. Yeah, well, I think most people who see bumblebees in their gardens notice them because of the size, and maybe also because of the noise, because they are pretty loud. They have a pretty big hum to them. And you're watching them go around the flowers foraging and so on. But I know bumblebees are one of the bees that have a distinct behavior where they're kind of the humming and the bumbling, the buzzing noise is actually really important for the pollination of certain plants, and it's referred to as buzz pollination. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it is intriguing, and it's somewhat unique to bumblebees. There are other large-bodied solitary native bees that can buzz pollinate, but honeybees either can't or don't do this, and so it is important. It's a niche that a fair number, I think it's something like 8 or 9% of plants on the planet, primarily use buzz pollination as their form of reproduction. And so, without bumblebees and some other native bees, those plants probably wouldn't be that as successful reproducing. So it is important, and it also is interesting and fun to watch. So buzz pollination, as I mentioned, it's like 8 or 9% of plants have their anthers, which is the male part of the flower where the pollen is stored inside of it, and their anthers are unique. Instead of sort of most the other sort of 90% of plants have their pollen sort of on the outside, freely available. You can go up and touch the flower and get the pollen on your fingers. It's just grains, they're sort of attached, and you can, if your fingers were small enough, you could pull the grains off. And if you were a bee, you can just manipulate it with your legs and get it right off of there. And that's, think about a honeybee. That's what they're doing, is they're sort of pulling that pollen off of the anthers. These 8 or 9% that benefit from buzz pollination, they have what are called poricidal anthers, which you can kind of think about as a salt shaker. So the pollen's kind of inside, and then there are pores on the outside of the anthers through which the pollen can escape, but it's not freely available. And so the only way to get that pollen out of those anthers is to shake them. And so that's what bumblebees are doing, and other species of bees do this too, as I mentioned. When they buzz pollinate, they're going up to those anthers and they're grabbing onto them and they're vibrating their wings to shake the plant. There's some question as to like how important the sound is actually to the buzz pollination, or whether it's actually just the shaking and the vibration that's the important piece. There's some relatively new evidence that suggests that the sound actually isn't that important. In the past, I think we've talked a lot about how sort of it has to be some particular frequency or whatever. And I think there's some evidence that it's actually not a frequency thing. It's more just shaking, and the sound is the outcome, or is a sort of benefit of that happening. And it may not be actually the important piece. So that's sort of an interesting piece, and I think something that's been explored by researchers right now as we sort of look into this. But yeah, the sort of ultimate take home is in order to get that pollen out of that poricidal anther, they have to shake it. And so you'll see bumblebees that'll go up and they'll often like curve, and they'll put the underside of their bodies sort of on top of those anthers or underneath the anthers if the flower's hanging upside down, and they vibrate their bodies. And you can hear this, like, when a bumblebee flies through your garden, you'll hear that sort of bomber sound. And then they'll land on the tomato flower or whatever, species of flower that benefits from buzz pollination, and they start buzzing very differently, like bzz, 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 bzz. And that's when they're sort of vibrating those wings and shaking that flower, and you can literally see sometimes the pollen come, pouring out of those anthers, just like you would in a salt shaker, the salt coming out of a salt shaker. And this is something you can, if you want to experiment with it, you can do it in your own garden. If you grow tomatoes, it's a good plant, and you can go out and take an electric toothbrush is a good vibrator that you can use, and if you just touch that to the anthers, you can actually see the pollen come shooting out of those plants. And there are a fair number of commercial plants that do benefit from buzz pollination. Tomatoes, I've mentioned, is one of them. Bell peppers is another. Eggplants is another. And then some things like blueberries and cranberries also benefit from buzz pollination as well. So, and there's a lot of native plants as well that aren't necessarily commercial or agriculturally important, but also benefit from buzz pollination. So yeah, it's a neat. Oh, so sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I was assuming there were some native plants that benefit from buzz pollination, because I can't imagine that bumblebees kind of figured this out and went, oh, that's a crop plant, I better go and do that,
Yeah, right. Yeah, there definitely are.
Yeah. No, I've encountered bumblebees doing the buzz pollination. It is a very distinctive sound that they make. Once or twice I've been walking along and I'm like, what's that noise? And then suddenly realize that you've just gone past a bumblebee buzz pollinating. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. It's pretty
Yeah.
fun, and it's also, it can be helpful too if you're like a researcher looking for bumblebees. Sometimes we use our ears more than we do our eyes, and if you're looking in a plant that's sort of diverse and hard to see all the flowers, sometimes you'll actually hear that behavior before you see the bumblebee, and that can be a good cue of, oh, I need to stick around here a little bit and look for that animal. So that's helpful too.
Well, thank you for explaining all that. I think that gives us a really good overview of bumblebees and a little taste of their life history. I think we could talk a lot more about that. But kind of talking about their populations and maybe some of the community science work that you've really been focused on at Xerces. Before we dive into that, can you tell us how many species of bumblebees there are out there in the world, and then maybe just in North America and then in the US?
Yeah, there are probably around 300 species of bumblebees in the world. And I say probably around, it's hard to come up with a specific number because there's a lot of research going on. Sort of, it's the same in every taxonomy. There's lumpers and splitters. Some people think species groups are 2 species or 3 species. Other people think it's 1 species. So let's just say there's around 300 species of bumblebees in the world, and we'll call it good. Someone will probably be upset with me for saying that, but we'll just say there's 300 species in the world. The sort of epicenter of diversity and where we believe bumblebees sort of evolved from is around the Himalaya, where there are probably well over 100 species of bumblebees. So that's kind of the epicenter of bumblebee diversity, and then sort of things radiate out from there. Here in North America, we have roughly 50 species of bumblebees. If we include Mexico, maybe we get up to 55 different species of bumblebees in North America, which Mexico is part of North America. So yeah, let's just say there's 55 species of bumblebees in North America. And then if we just look at the US, things probably narrow closer to 50 species. If we were to remove Alaska from that, we may get down to like 46 or 45 in the lower 48 states. But since we have Alaska, we can get some of those polar species, and we'll just say there's 50 species in the US. Yeah, those are rough numbers, you know, and people might slightly disagree with them, but I think we're in the right ballpark.
And you know, so that, I mean, we keep hearing in the news about bees facing threats, habitat loss, pesticides, diseases, and so on. I mean, in general, how are bumblebees doing? Are there species that are facing extinction or threats, or are they just all doing hunky-dory and fine?
We probably wouldn't be having this conversation if they were all just be doing hunky-dory and fine. Unfortunately. I mean, yeah, there's winners and losers, I think is the best way to say it. There are some species that are doing just fine, that are potentially even expanding their range, and maybe their populations are increasing. But there are other species that are facing real threats. The research that we've done over the last decade or so suggests that around a quarter of the bumblebee species in North America are facing some degree of extinction risk. And in addition to my role at Xerces, I also help coordinate the IUCN Red List Bumblebee Specialist Group, which is an organization that looks at extinction risk of animals. And obviously the Bumblebee Specialist Group is focused on bumblebees. And if we look sort of worldwide and look at what proportion of the species are imperiled, it's also around a quarter. So, you know, sort of worldwide, as well as in North America, around a quarter of our bumblebees are facing some degree of extinction risk. So here in North America, 50 species, that means we've got 12 or 13 of them that are, you know, imperiled in some degree. And there's some range of that between sort of like, boy, it's sort of their populations are trending downwards, but they're still prevalent in most places. They're just a little bit more rare than they used to be. And then there's other species that, you know, actually may already be extinct. And the best example of that is Franklin's bumblebee, which is a species that is native to a very small range in Southern Oregon and Northern California, that, you know, once was relatively common, or at least findable throughout that region. And it hasn't been seen since 2006. It's listed as a federally endangered species. But, you know, according to some people, it very well may be extinct. There's a lot of survey efforts still going on for it. It lives in a relatively wild, remote area of the country, so it very well may still be out there, but it hasn't been seen in a long time. And then, you know, there's a species in the eastern United States called the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, that has disappeared from 90% of its range or so. You know, it's also listed as an endangered species. There's a number, and when I say listed as an endangered species, that means that it's been added to the Endangered Species Act, which is a federal law here in the United States. So it has federal protections. There's actually regulations in place to help that species recover, or those species recover. So when it's hard when we talk about these things because we use these terms endangered, I think sometimes liberally, and sometimes they actually have definitions. So when I say it's listed as an endangered species, I mean like in the literal sense that it has regulations attached to it. There's many of those other 12 or 13 species that I mentioned earlier that are imperiled have been also petitioned for endangered species listing. So many of them are in the process of being assessed by the Fish and Wildlife Service about whether, federal protections are warranted or not. And they're sort of moving through that pipeline somewhat slowly. But yeah, as I mentioned, there's other species, the other, 30 some odd species, 38 species, 37 species. So most of them seem to be doing okay from what we can tell. It is worth saying that we don't have the best information on the population status of bumblebees. It's not like birds and mammals that we've been studying for decades, that we know exactly where they live, we know relative population numbers, we know their reproductive rates, and we can really measure these things at a sort of quantitative way. The data that we have on bumblebees is better than it is on a lot of other bee species, but it's still, we're decades behind where we might be with mammals and birds, and we're trying to get there with the data that we have on these species, so that we can truly start measuring them and look at trends over a longer run with more certainty, so that we can make more informed conservation decisions with the relatively limited resources that we have to dedicate towards them.
Well, and that's the perfect segue to my next question is, the one thing that you've done with Xerces, which has been really astounding to see even since I've been at Xerces, just how much it's grown and developing and launching the Bumblebee Atlas. You started out with the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which was Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And now, 5 years later, it's in 20 states and covers 53% of the lower 48 of the US, which is really amazing. Can you tell us about this Atlas project and how is it helping bumblebees? You sort of alluded to that already, but yeah, we'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, those numbers are, it's been a really fun ride, and really exciting, not only for me professionally and obviously advancing conservation, but seeing the hundreds and thousands of volunteers that have engaged and created sort of a community for bumblebee conservation in North America has just been a really heartening part of my work. So thank you for those of you that are listening that have participated and contributed. We couldn't be here without your engagement. Bumblebees sell themselves. Thankfully, they're beloved creatures, and we're lucky to have that on our side. So, but yeah, it's we launched these Atlas programs about 6 years ago, and the purpose behind launching them was again this lack of data that we really had. I had assessed the extinction risk for North American bumblebees, and in so doing realized how sort of poor the data was. And so I sort of set out to be like, okay, how can we gather more data and have it be more effective for conservation decision making, as opposed to just sort of having these random points on a map. And so, the initial thing that we did is we built this community science platform called Bumblebee Watch, which is where we collect all of our data. And we recognized relatively quickly, once we launched Bumblebee Watch, that we were getting a lot of data, like tens of thousands of records quickly, all over North America. But when we looked at the spatial distribution of those records, we were just mapping cities and roads. And there's a lot of invasive plants in cities and roads, and it's biased towards different species groups that maybe thrive in those environments. And so we sort of schemed about how we can do a better job of collecting data that's better distributed spatially, so that we can learn how they're doing in our remote, sort of intact areas where maybe no one had looked recently. And so we took, starting with the Pacific Northwest, we took them and we divided those 3 states up into 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer grid cells. And we made those grid cells available for community scientists to adopt them, and then commit to going out into those areas and doing surveys for us. And the important part about the surveys that folks were doing is not only were they just like reporting the bumblebees that they saw, but they were also recording how much effort they were spending into it. So our surveys are a hectare, which is about 2.5 acres of habitat. They're 45 minutes long, and folks capture every bumblebee that they see. They put it into a plastic or a glass jar. They put that glass jar into a cooler with ice, and then they take really detailed photographs of those bees and submit the photographs to Bumblebee Watch, along with some habitat data and the effort that they spent looking for those bees. And then all the bees get released back into the environment. So that it's all non-lethal sampling. And then we have an expert that looks at all the photos and does the verification. So that's sort of a rough image of the survey. But the important, just stepping back a little bit, the important part about recording effort is then we can not only say where we find species, but we can also say where we didn't find species, right? So the previous data that we have, or if you look at sort of iNaturalist or a lot of the other bee data that's out there, it's just the presence points on a map, but we don't know how hard someone looked for other species. But now we have all these spots on the map where we know people went out, we know that they spent 45 minutes looking for bees, and we know what species they found. We also know what species they didn't find. We don't know that species is absent from that site, but we can at least say someone went and looked, they spent this amount of effort and they didn't find it, which is a lot more information than we have just by getting these presence points. And I don't want to get too into the weeds here, and we probably could get there quickly. So I'll stop and sort of see if you have any follow-up questions. But that's the sort of gist of the program. And over the last 6 years, I think we've had 1,600 people participate in the Pacific Northwest that have submitted a bumblebee observation or done a survey for us. And we have, I think there were something like 520 grid cells, and we've surveyed, 515 of them or something like that. So we've really completely covered the Pacific Northwest with survey effort and have a really good picture of how species are doing here. And that is, as you say, has now been expanded into 20 states in the lower 48, mostly focused west of the Mississippi, although we do have a project in the southeastern United States in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia.
Yeah, the follow-up question I was going to ask is, if someone wants to participate, how can they find out more? And also, are there states where you have a particular, where you really want more, or you're launching a new one maybe?
The best place to learn more is to go to Bumblebee Atlas, all one word, even though it's more than one word, no spaces, Bumblebee Atlas, no spaces.org. And from there, you can see the map of the states that we're in. The places that will be brand new in 2024 which is kind of exciting. We're sort of launching in your neck of the woods, Rachel, but in sort of a brand new region of the country. So we'll be in Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, and Utah. Those are the 5 new states for 2024. So we'll definitely be looking for volunteers in those 5 states. The other places that are sort of just getting up and running is the southeastern United States, as I just mentioned, will be entering its 2nd year. So those will be key states if folks are living in those regions of the country to get engaged as well. And yeah, again, the best place is bumblebeeatlas.org to learn more.
Great.
I'm very excited that it's coming to Montana and the Rockies. I think that's great. And, I think the funding that coming in just shows that people care about bumblebees and they know that this work is really important. So yeah, congratulations to you and all of your efforts and the rest of the staff that run this program. I think it's just really incredible. It's very heartwarming.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And it's been, not only does it feel like sort of we're collecting this data and yay, we have data, but the data are actually actively being used. Like the data from our Pacific Northwest Atlas project went directly into the species status assessment for Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, as they were trying to decide whether that species was warranted for endangered species listing. And the type of data that we're collecting are exactly the type of data that they were hoping to have for that process. And so I think multiple different land management agencies or regulatory agencies have recognized the importance of these efforts. And just obviously I could go out and do this data at a smaller scale, but like it's so hard to cover these large regional areas in a relatively short period of time without the help of like hundreds of volunteers. And so engaging the public in active conservation projects is just a really effective way, to educate the people, have them engaged in this work, and then have them learn, this new group of animals that also, increases our love and appreciation for the natural world. So it's really, yeah, thank you. It's been a great experience, and I feel really lucky to do it every day. So thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to end on what is not my favorite question, because I asked you that last time, but I came up with a new one. It's kind of an oddball, but I'm just going to go with it. If you had the choice of being able to communicate with a bee, any bee you want, or with your favorite conservationist, contemporary or historical, which would you choose and why? And if you choose a bee, which bee would it be and why? And then which conservationist would you choose if it was a conservationist?
I'll tell you what, it's a hard question. I don't even know how to really approach answering it. Other than to say, I just read this book called An Immense World, which is a very interesting sort of take on how we experience the world and how we sort of force that on other animals. And so what the book really tries to do is it goes through many different species from like, bumblebees are talked about in there. It talks about dogs, it talks about fish, it talks about sharks, and just what senses they have to interact with the world and how different that is from human sort of perception of the world. We're such a visual species, and taste and hearing and smell and touch are somewhat important for us, but we're really visual, and we describe the world through our eyes. And I think a lot of other animals don't experience the world that way at all. And this book really opened my eyes. See, there's a phrase that we use like that is so biased in human experience, but it really opened my eyes to like these ideas and thinking. And so I think because of that, I think it would be fascinating to be able to speak with a bee and just find out how they sense the world and to learn more about what is important in the world to them, and sort of how what human beings are doing are affecting that, so that we can be more mindful of our daily activities. An example of that is just they were talking about whales and how some of the ways that whales can like sing and communicate in the ocean can travel like literally tens of thousands of kilometers across the ocean, and like how boats and sonar and other things are impacting their ability to communicate. And that's just scratching the surface in terms of our perception. But it would be fascinating to talk with a bee and just learn all of that, as well as I could ask them questions like, where do you nest? Where are you overwinter? Like, tell me more. How do we find the answers to these questions that so many of us are trying to figure out right now? And I don't know if I have a particular species of bee that I would want to talk to, if I could. But I do have an affinity for Morrison's bumblebee, Bombus morrisoni. It lives in sagebrush steppe country, which is a landscape that is near and dear to my heart, and it's just a beautiful animal. So I'll pick that one since you forced me to.
I love it. I have so much power.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that answer. Yeah, I wish we could talk to him too. We could ask so many great questions. It would save us a lot of time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could probably solve a lot of these complex issues relatively quickly if we could just have those conversations.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Rich. This was such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about bumblebees and many other things. So we'll have to have you back again. But we so much appreciate your time, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate it as well. And congrats on expanding the Atlas program. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
We hope people get involved.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Matthew. It's really a
Yeah, you're
pleasure to
welcome.
talk to you, and hopefully your listeners will find it as interesting as you did.
I'm sure they will. Bug Banter is brought to you by the Xerces Society, a donor-based nonprofit that is working to protect insects and other invertebrates, the life that sustains us. If you are already a donor, thank you so much. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/donate. For information about this podcast and for show notes, go to xerces.org/bugbanter.